Welcome to the How Did They Do It Real Estate Podcast. Have you ever wondered how people succeed in real estate and what steps they took to get there? If so, this podcast is for you. Your hosts, Sayla and Eileen Prack, interview top experts in the real estate community to share with you their real estate journey and how they achieved massive success. Our goal is to provide you with valuable real estate resources and to help you apply it to your own real estate goal. Welcome to today's episode of the How Did They Do It Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Prack, and today our guest is Abbas Mohammed. And a little bit about Abbas, he became one of the top 50 agents nationwide with RE/MAX in less than 5 years of being in business. And over the years, he decided that he wanted to focus more on the multifamily apartment space. And so he's now the founder and CEO of Model Equity, a multifamily firm. And so Abbas, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Abbas, can you share with us a little bit more about your background and how you got started with real estate?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was born and raised in Iraq. Growing up, didn't have any money. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, we used to sleep on concrete because we couldn't afford to have beds. And so after the war, we lost our house. Moved to Syria. And then from Syria, I came to the US when I was 11 years old. And, when I came to the US, my family didn't have any money. We were on food stamps. We were on housing assistance and all these different welfare programs. And so by the time I was 18, I was like, you know what? I could go to college, which I was doing at the time. I was like, I could go to college. I could do that. But I just don't see that as a method of becoming financially free at any point, because I could make $50,000, $60,000 a year. And it just wasn't good enough for me. And so I actually decided to get my real estate license when I was 18 years old. I was selling cars and I was kind of good at sales at the time. Not very good, but I was decent enough for an 18-year-old. And so then I got my real estate license on a credit card because I saw 90% of all millionaires are made through real estate. So I'm like, okay, I don't need to think about this too much. I'll just get into real estate. And so I got my license, thought it was going to be easy because I live in the Bay Area. The average home is like $1 million. And I thought if I get 2.5%, 3%, that's 30,000 per transaction. And I could do that every week. But I was very wrong. It took me 12 months of cold calling before I got my first transaction. But after I did my first transaction, then I got another one and a third and a fourth. Within 2 years of being in business, I was 20 years old. I was making about $350,000. But so I started doing well, but I wanted to quit every single day for the first year when I was failing at it. And then I started learning how to hire people and virtual assistants and all that stuff, and grew the team to 25 virtual assistants, especially through COVID when everybody else was shutting down. I started hiring more. And that's when I was able to basically triple my income every year. We were doing about $1.5 million to $2 million in profit every year. And it was at that point that I actually decided to get into multifamily, because what happened is I was accumulating cash. I knew how to make money, but I just didn't know what to invest it in. What I did know is I didn't want to do single family houses because I was selling single family houses. And I saw my clients, the way they operated them and how much hassle it was dealing with the tenants, getting the rents, evictions. I mean, I had a client one time who took 12 months just to evict a tenant. She was not getting a penny from her property, and yet she was having to pay the mortgage. And so I always looked at that. I'm like, this is not something I want to deal with at all. And also, a lot of times you have all these issues that come up that you don't even account for. So I just decided I didn't want to do single family. And I didn't want to do stocks because I didn't really understand stocks really too well. And so then I found out about multifamily and I decided to go all in.
So going back to when you first moved to this country, not having really a network or support, you didn't have other family members who had paved the path for you before you got here. And so you really had to rely on yourself and figuring out the path on your own. Your parents probably were working as well, and they're trying to make it and provide for you and your family too at that time. So when you decided to get into real estate, how did you, I know you mentioned that, 90% of millionaires were made through real estate, but how did you come across real estate? Like, what got you into it in the beginning?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the time I was 18 years old. I was kind of an idiot, really, to be honest with you. I was ignorant, but I was like, look, I mean, I had a credit card that had $5,000 on it. I'm like, I know that if I wanted to get rich, because that's what I was only concerned about getting rich at that time because I was so broke, so poor to the point where it's like the only thing that mattered is money at the time. And I think money matters a lot. I'm not downplaying it now, but it's not like I'm not like as, I guess, focused on just money anymore. I want to grow the company. I want to grow the brand, and that I enjoy more than just the money aspect of it. But anyway, the point is I looked at myself and I'm like, well, what options do I have? I know if I want to get richer, I need to be in business. And I looked at 90% of millionaires are in real estate. And so I'm like, okay, well, what business could I start? And after looking through a bunch of things, I just realized I didn't have the money to do flipping. At the time, I didn't know anything about wholesaling. And so I was like, look, I guess I could just get my real estate license because it only costs $2,000. It's a very low barrier to entry type of business. And so I got my real estate license and I knew nothing about the business. I literally had no idea what any of these things were in real estate. And so sometimes I remember I would talk to potential leads and they knew more about real estate and selling houses than I did because they've sold houses and I hadn't sold a single house yet.
So when you got your license, then what was the plan after you got the license? Like, how did you know what were the next steps to be able to start building out your business? Yeah.
So at the time, I looked at some agents that were pretty successful, and the way they got business was through cold calling. And I'm sorry, not cold calling, door knocking. And so then I decided, literally, this was the first, I got my license. And a couple of days later, got in with a brokerage. Before I even got my business cards or any of that stuff, I started door knocking. The minute I got approved into a brokerage, I went out, started door knocking, just asking people if they were looking to sell their houses. And at the time, you got to remember, I was 18 years old. I was overweight. I was 245 pounds. And so I was very, very overweight at the time. But anyway, nobody took me seriously. I would go out, I would door knock, I had the full suit on, and I didn't get a single lead for 3 months. And I remember during that time, like I said, I was thinking about quitting every day, but then I actually ran out of money. My credit card maxed out. So then I had to go back to selling cars. And I was like, okay, well, what's the next thing I could do if I want to stay in this business and try another way? And what I realized is if I'm going to be in the car dealership, there were times where I couldn't sell a car to anybody because we didn't have customers. And so then I would start cold calling. So I had one headset on. I connected it to this thing. It's a dialer that would let you dial 3 people at the same time. And then I put on a second headset. So I had 2 headsets on at the same time. I was dialing 6 people. And I did that for 12 months before I got my first deal. And it was kind of crazy, but I got my first deal, made $30,000 at the time or $40,000, paid off all my credit card debt. And then shortly after got a second deal and a third deal and just started snowballing from there.
So do you think it was just the sheer volume of the people that you were contacting and cold calling that helped to grow your business? Or was there something else as a real estate agent that helped you get to, you said $350,000 per year? Yeah, that's when I was 20 at the time. But yeah, so what happened is, it was a number of things. One is I made every mistake you could make as an agent. Like there were no more mistakes left. I literally sucked at it for a year. So that was that. The other thing is I looked at it and I was like, look, I really want to quit on this. And I wanted to quit every day. So I was like, I'll just quit on the idea of quitting. And now quitting is no longer an option. So if quitting is no longer an option, I'm just going to keep cold calling, and one day it's going to work. It might take a year, it might take 5 years, who knows? But one day it's going to work. And so I just kept at it. And that one day came 12 months later. And I was dialing, like I said, just dials, not pickups, but dials. I was doing about 4,000 to 5,000 dials per day. And 12 months later, I built a lot of relationships with people that were thinking of selling in the future. And so eventually they did want to sell. And that's when I started getting my first transaction. And then later on, when I was making $350,000 a year, I was like, wait, I could duplicate myself if I hire other people to do what I just did. And so then at the time of COVID, I had hired 3 people, and then I hired a hiring manager, and I said, your job is to continue hiring right now. And so she took us from 3 people to 12. And I went from 350,000 to 750,000 that year in profit. And then the following year, we went from 12 people to 25 people. And then we did 1.7 million in profit. And so, that's when I started looking at getting into multifamily. Okay. So then when you were cold calling, how did you get your list for that volume? Because you were calling 4,000 to 5,000 people every single day. Yeah. So how did you build out that list to begin with? It's very easy. So it's interesting. All of our information is
easily accessible. Like I could, as long as I know your full name and I know where you live in terms of like which county you live in, I could get your cell phone number, I could get your email, and it cost me 20 cents at most, maybe even 10 cents right now. But anyway, the point is you could buy these huge databases online of homeowners. And then what we would do is we would buy the homeowner list, upload it on the CRM, and by the end of it, when I left my sales business, I now have somebody else running it for me. When I left that business, we had close to 2 million numbers that we were dialing. And those were everybody basically in the Bay Area. I mean, in the Bay Area, we had 7.5 million people. I had 2 million phone numbers for them.
Got it. And then what was your script when you called and somebody actually picked up?
Yeah, I kept it. You know what I realized is that the simpler you keep it, the more effective it is, because nobody wanted to deal with somebody if they weren't interested. So we would just call and say, hey, my name is X. I work with X company. And I was just calling to see if you're thinking of selling your house. And people might say no or hang up. And some might say, I'm kind of thinking about it. And if that's the case, then we ask more questions. When, where, why? And then I hired salespeople that would keep following up and all that stuff. And then eventually I was just going on listing appointments every day. And I remember one day I got burned out on it because it's like, for months, I was going on a listing appointment every single day of the week, and I didn't have a life. I had no time off. And one day I went to this person's house, and we focused on lower income households because they didn't have relationships, so they didn't have agents to work with. So one day I went to this person's house. I sat down on the table. I bought a brand new suit at the time, sat down on the table, put my hand down, and then I lift my arm and I see this like stick of butter that was all over my brand new suit. I'm like, you know what? I'm done with this business. I need to get out of here.
That was the last straw for you.
That was the last straw. I was so sick of it. I felt like I was, even though I was making a good amount of money from it, I just felt like I was living life on repeat. Every single day was the same. And it was great because I learned so much about business. I learned how to hire. I learned how to scale. I learned how to market. I learned how sales. I learned a bunch of things. But at the end of it, I felt like, I kind of figured it all out, and it became just a mindless activity that I was doing every single day. And it was almost like having golden handcuffs, where it's like, you're kind of too afraid to try something new because it's hard to replace that amount of income every year. But I'm like, you know what? If I was 80 years old on my deathbed, if this keeps going, I would not be happy living the life I'm living right now, because I know I'm not going up to my full potential. And so that's when I started looking at other avenues.
So did you figure out entrepreneurship and running a business on your own, or were you also working with somebody to help guide you as well?
I've always had mentors. I'm a big believer in coaching. And so like, I remember when I was 18, one of the first things I did is I hired a coach for $1,000 also on my credit card. I couldn't afford it, but I'm like, look, this guy's been doing it for 30 years. I have never done this before. And so I could compress time with his knowledge. And so I hired a coach. Later on, I kind of got burned out on coaches because I didn't do it correctly. What I mean by that is I would hire a coach, and this was my first coach. I hired a coach. He was able to get me to his level, right? But then I would expect them to advise me on every area of life. But the reality is they were only an expert at one thing up to a certain level. And I kind of started begrudging my mentor at the time because I'm like, God, why can't he help me scale beyond 350? He was telling me to just keep doing it myself. I was already working 15 hours a day. And if I want to go to 1 million, I can't do more hours. And so at the time I got burned out on coaching. Later on, I realized it was my fault because look, I mean, a person only knows so much. And at some point, it's kind of like, I think of mentors now as kind of like trains, where you get on a train, they get you to a certain point. You have to respect them for where they got you to, but then you get off that train, you move on to another train, and that helps you get to the next stop, right? But anyway, so I just kind of improved my mentality about it over time. But I was a kid, I was just trying to figure things out.
So how did you come across multifamily?
Yeah. So what happened is this was early 2021. I remember walking through downtown San Jose, and I'm like, God, what's next for me? Like, I don't want to keep doing what I'm doing. And by the way, for a lot of you guys out there that are listening to this, you might have a job where you're in the same boat, right? You might have another business where and it doesn't matter how much money you're making. I think a lot of us get to that point where we just kind of feel like, hey, we want to move on to something else. And so for me at the time, I was walking downtown San Jose and I look at this huge building and I'm like, God, this is such a nice building. How much would it cost if I wanted to buy something like this in my life? And it was like a big commercial office, right? I'm like, and I realized at the time that at the trajectory I was going at, I would never be able to do it. And also I had a bunch of money sitting in the bank that I didn't know what to do with as well. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I could do something different that could help me move at a faster trajectory where I could one day buy a building like this. And right now I know I can't do it, but one day I could. And so then I started looking into different asset classes in commercial space. I looked at self-storage, I looked at mobile homes, I looked at offices, I looked at retail, looked at multifamily, and multifamily was the most appealing to me for many, many reasons. And so then I got a coach in multifamily and then just started passively investing because I wanted to try it. I wanted to see if it was something that was real or not. So I passively invested a lot of money. And then afterwards, I started actively buying deals. So I bought my first active deal in July of 2021, 64 units, 6.5 million. We had to raise $2 million on it. And so we did that. After we closed on that deal, I bought another deal that was 30 million and we raised $8 million on that. So within 6 months of actively doing it, I was able to get to 37 million of assets. And then in 2022, my plan, here's how I thought about it. I was like, okay, so I did 37 million in 6 months and I was brand new. So the next year, I'm going to be able to do at least 100 million, right? Because I have way more experience, I have way more relationships. But then 2022 came, and for the first 6 months, I looked at 400 deals and not a single one made sense. The market was way overpriced. I looked at people buying these deals and I'm like, how are they making sense of these numbers? Maybe the market is overpriced. So I started going to other markets and I had the exact same. I looked at Nashville, looked at Phoenix, looked at Tucson, looked at Florida deals, and the whole US was overpriced. So I stayed out of the market for 6 months. And then in July, I started buying again because interest rates went up, prices went down. So I started buying again and we bought a $12.8 million deal. So now we're at 54 million. And my target is to add an additional 100 million this year and get us to $1 billion in the next 5 years.
What did it take to make that transition between the single family versus the multifamily?
It took a lot of work for sure. But yeah, I mean, it was honestly, it was different and similar in a lot of ways. The ways where it was similar is that I've realized business is business. It doesn't matter what you're doing. The same concepts apply in any business you're at. The things that were different is I realized is obviously multifamily and commercial real estate. One is you're competing with people that are very, very smart. And so in order to beat them, you have to really work hard. You have to understand your craft at a very, very deep level. And you also have to be nimble. You know, like starting out as a newer person in multifamily, when I first got started, the only way I could have won these deals is by moving fast, building better relationships with brokers versus like if I was big and I had a bunch of employees, I maybe wouldn't have necessarily the time to go see these deals in person or go talk to the broker myself. And so I think that's kind of what set me apart when I first started. And I built a lot of relationships because I used to be a broker. I knew how to build relationships with other brokers. And so once I figured that out, I was able to build a lot of good relationships, get really good off-market deal flow. Like even up until now, we see deals about 3 to 4 months prior to them hitting the market. I get multiple emails a week where it's like, hey, we just signed this listing. Take a look at it. We're going to launch it in a few months. And so that helps us out tremendously because if you could build relationships with brokers, you will have much better deal flow than you would otherwise. So I focused on that early on. Afterwards now, the next focus for us has been equity raising. And so we've been doing a lot of educational events. We've been doing summits, webinars, and really building a community to educate people. So that way, when we have deal flow to put out there, they know that we put up a lot of work prior to ever sourcing an opportunity for them.
So when you did your first deal, maybe first 2 deals back in 2021, was that just on your own or were you working with other partners as well?
Yeah, so I partnered up with this other person who lives in Dallas. He's been in multifamily since 2012, buying large apartment complexes with just him and a few friends, but they never syndicated. And he was interested in syndicating, but he never did it. And so we met and we're like, okay, you know what? If we partner together, we could syndicate deals. And so he would be the asset manager. He's an expert at it. I was very good at acquisitions and better at sourcing equity at the time. And I've gotten much better at that since then. And so that's kind of how we divided up the role. So he would focus on asset management. I would focus on acquisition and investors.
Got it. So for you, was it difficult since you were primarily in the single family space before, and most of the valuation is based off of comparables and looking at the markets? When you're getting into multifamily, now you're looking at net operating income and operating it more as a business. So was that a difficult concept for you to make that transition and make that jump from single family into multifamily, just purely based off of how you're evaluating the property?
Yeah, it's actually, that's the part I like the most. I never liked how, and this is one of the reasons I decided not to invest in single families, because the single family houses, their values based on the comps and what the neighbors are selling for. And so what I wanted to invest in an asset class where the value would be based more on how I manage it. And so when I got into multifamily, that was one of the big reasons why I chose multifamily. I'm super analytical. I'm super detail oriented. And so I really enjoy looking at deals. I enjoy looking at numbers. I enjoy underwriting. And so to me, it was difficult to learn it, obviously, because it's a very different skill set. But once I learned it, I mean, I remember I used to underwrite. When I first got in, I would underwrite deals for 8 hours a day. And I did that for a very, very long time in order to really learn it. But I actually really enjoy that part more than anything. And if I could just focus on one thing, it would be underwriting and looking at deals. But I know I can't just do that because there are other aspects of the business I need to also focus on.
So what's next for you coming up here?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing right now for us is I believe right now is a great time to buy assets. And so there's not much on the market yet because sellers don't want to sell at these reduced prices from last year. And so I'm just prepping for when sellers get back on the market. And I think that's going to happen over the next 1 or 2 quarters. In the probably next 6 months, we're going to see more deal flow. So I'm just growing my investor database as much as possible. So that way, when those deals do start to come on the market, I don't want to be sitting on the sidelines. And so I'm just preparing for that. I think this is going to be one of the best years to take over assets that at insane prices that we wouldn't be able to otherwise.
What is the biggest thing in your underwriting that you had to change, especially with the change in the market and with the interest rates and the current environment that we have today?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I always tell people is that the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest risk in deals isn't just the deal itself. The number one most important thing is the market. But the second is the loan product that you've got on the deal. If you have the wrong loan product or a bad loan on it, then any good deal could turn into a bad deal. And so the biggest change we've made is low leverage. We're very low leverage on deals now. I just focus on 50 to 60%. Because then it's like the risk level is very, very low. The other thing I focus on a lot nowadays is instead of going for short-term debt, I see a lot of deals even up till this day where they use 3-year loans. And to me, that's too risky. I'm looking at deals where I would basically put on loans that have either 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years, but ideally 7 years, because in my opinion, even if the market was to go down 7 years from now, it should be fine, right? And you'll have the ability to exit and the valuations go back up. But one of the interesting loan products that we're actually looking at on deals when we underwrite nowadays is what's called basically a 10-7 type of loan. And if you don't know what that is, for those that are listening, it's a loan product that lets you have 10-year term, right? But you could exit at year 7 without paying a prepayment penalty. You could always exit whenever you want, but there's a prepayment penalty depending on when you exit. But at year 7, they remove that prepayment penalty. So it gives you the option to stay in it long term if you need to, but it also gives you the option to exit earlier if you want to. And so to me, that's the type of thing I'm looking at right now is I want to be super conservative with the type of loans we get on these properties.
So Abbas, how has real estate investing impacted your life?
I mean, it's been incredible. One is inflation. Obviously, sitting on cash, I would look at inflation, and that was always a worry because it's like inflation sitting at 7.5%, 8%. And if you have, let's say you have $1 million in the bank, At 7.5%, that's $75,000 that's going away due to inflation every single year. If we have 100,000 in the bank, that's 7,500. And so you got to divide it per month. If you take 7,500, you divide it per month, that's hundreds of dollars a month that's going away just in inflation. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much inflation actually hurts them. So to me, number one was the ability to put cash into assets that are that have historically benefited from inflation. The other thing is just building passive cash flow on these deals. So that's been phenomenal. But also the tax deductions. It's interesting. I think that's one of the least looked on aspects of investing is the tax deductions. I was able to write off close to $800,000 of income in 2021 because I invested in real estate, and that got me a refund of actually not close to, it's over $250,000. I got a $258,000 refund from the IRS because I invested in real estate. And so it's like the tax savings, the cash flow, the hedge against inflation. I mean, it's been incredible.
If there was one thing that you know now about real estate that you didn't know when you first started, what would it be?
I wish I would have started doing multifamily sooner. That's the only, I guess, regret I have, is that I spent too much time on single family and didn't move to multifamily sooner.
If you had to go back, would you have started straight off with multifamily, or would you have still started with single family first?
You know, when I started, I was not skilled. I didn't have money. So I think if I would have started in multifamily at that time as an active investor, I would have failed because I wouldn't have known how to build a business, how to compete with other people and all that stuff. As a passive investor, I wouldn't have had the money to invest at all. And so I'm glad I started the way I did. But if you're listening to this and you already have a job, you've already got income, maybe you've already got retirement accounts, and you want to do passive investing, I don't think you need to go single family, then duplexes, then fourplexes, then multifamily. I would just jump straight into multifamily. That's what I ended up doing when I started investing. And so I think I would have started the same way. But if you're already ahead of where I was when I was 18, which is everybody basically, then you should be fine. You don't need to go the single family route.
And what is the one thing that sets the successful people apart in real estate investing?
That's a good question. It's interesting. I think the ones, if I look at historically, the ones that have continued to do well in up cycles and down cycles were the ones that have been conservative in their loans, right? And also the ones that chose really, really good markets. And that's why I'm very specific about the markets that we choose, because a good market will forgive dump mistakes. A bad market will punish you even if you do everything right. And so I'm very focused on the market and I'm very focused on loans.
Abbas, where can our listeners find out more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, I think the best way is to connect with me, see what we're doing. And you could also book a call, by the way, as well for free, is if you go and make an investor account on our website, completely free, doesn't cost you a penny, but then that will give you access to our future deal flow. And so the way to do that is you go to modelequity.com/invest, modelequity.com/invest.
Abbas, thank you so much for all your time today. I really appreciate it.
Of course, I appreciate you for having me on.
And thank you for listening to our podcast today, brought to you by Bonavest Capital. We would really appreciate it if you can go to iTunes right now and leave a rating and written review. Also, please don't forget to subscribe so you can always get the latest episodes. You can also connect with us on Facebook, How Did They Do It Real Estate. We'd love to hear your feedback and any topics that you're interested in for future episodes. Lastly, to learn more about us, you can go to bonavestcapital.com and fill out the Contact Us page so you can speak to us directly. Nothing on the show should be considered as specific personal advice. Please consult your legal, tax, and real estate professionals for individualized advice.